Thank you. Working together, we will begin the urgent task of rebuilding our nation and renewing the American dream.
It was November the 9th, 2016, and Donald Trump had just been elected the new president of the USA. Hillary Clinton, the favorite, had lost. Vladimir Putin was one of the first to congratulate the surprise winner, Donald Trump.
Russia wants to completely restore its relationship with the USA.
The fact that Trump was focusing on the slogan, "Make America Great Again," that he wanted to promote his country rather than pushing for globalization, was good news for us Russians.
President Putin and President Trump shook hands on a new friendship. But the first 2 years of Trump's presidency were overshadowed by the so-called Russia affair, allegations of conspiracy against the United States. Did the two men really collude?
I never worked for Russia, and you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia.
There were signs of male bonding every time the two presidents met. But could a true partnership ever really develop? Could these men really become friends, or were their states destined to remain enemies? On January the 20th, 2017, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 45th President of the United States of America.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Could the relationship with Moscow be reset?
Putin was entertaining the hope that he could create a different kind of relationship with the USA to the previous one, which meant gradually rebuilding the world to fit his own rules and turning Russia back into a superpower. He and Trump would make a deal on how the rest of the world would live.
But Moscow's hopes for a fresh beginning with Washington were soon dashed. First of all, by Nikki Haley, Trump's new ambassador to the United Nations. Haley's first appearance in February 2017 marked a tougher stance.
I consider it unfortunate that the occasion of my first appearance here is one in which I must condemn the aggressive actions of Russia. The dire situation in eastern Ukraine is one that demands clear and strong condemnation of Russian actions.
Contrary to all of Trump's previous comments, Ambassador Haley confirmed that US sanctions would remain in place until Russia withdrew from annexed Crimea. The US government's anti-Russian tack continued. In March, FBI Director James Comey confirmed that his authorities would be conducting an official investigation into the allegations that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 US election campaign.
And that includes investigating the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and whether there was any coordination between the campaign and Russia's efforts.
In April, UN Ambassador Haley once again condemned Russia's complicity with the Syrian Assad regime, citing a poison gas attack.
Yesterday morning, we awoke to pictures, to children foaming at the mouth, suffering convulsions, being carried in the arms of desperate parents. The truth is that Assad, Russia, and Iran have no interest in peace. When the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action.
Three days later, US missiles hit the Syrian military airport from where the poison gas attack had allegedly been launched.
Now, Trump is also at a point where he needs to distance himself somewhat to push back against these allegations that he's too close to Putin and to Russia, and he launches this missile strike that gets him the first positive headlines, I think, of his presidency on foreign relations for having taken a decisive step there.
Russia's state media were not impressed.
According to social media, these containers were used for chemical weapons, allegedly at the military airport of Al-Shairat. This was why the U.S. military bombed this airport. In reality, these containers had nothing to do with chemical weapons. They were used for various military purposes, for the transport of weapons and other equipment.
Caught up in a storm of recriminations, President Trump changed his tune and praised NATO while admonishing Russia.
Right now, we're not getting along with Russia at all. We may be at an all-time low in terms of relationship with Russia.
Vladimir Putin entirely agreed. In his eyes, Trump was just a pawn in the political chess game.
At the beginning, the development of this domestic policy dispute was still quite amusing. Today, we were sad and concerned to imagine what kind of crazy notions these people will come up with next. All they are doing is stirring up anti-Russian sentiment.
This was the atmosphere in which the two presidents first met face-to-face in July 2017 at the G20 summit in Hamburg.
President Trump seems to be a little more casual about his appearance before Putin, and Putin was a little more formal. He stood up a little more ramrod straight in his chair.
And it's an honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you, Lou. Thank you.
It was interesting to a degree to hear President Trump tell President Putin that it was, quote, an honor to be with him, given the environment and the climate that we're in with all of the allegations about Russia and its meddling in the 2016 presidential election.
The private meeting lasted for over 2 hours. According to the Trump camp, the US president gave Putin a dressing down for meddling in the US elections. But both now wanted to concentrate on the future.
I think, if we continue as we started yesterday, there is reason to believe that we will succeed in restoring our cooperation.
In the evening, at the G20 dinner hosted by Angela Merkel, the two presidents held a second secret meeting.
Of course, if you're at the G20 dinner, there's nothing really private because there are 20 world leaders along with their entourages, add in the leaders of the European Union, and it's quite a crowded room. So could they have had a private word with interpreters? Sure. Is much important business going to happen in that context? Very unlikely.
Back home in Washington, Trump's appearance in Hamburg had caused a stir.
Trump was accused of being a Kremlin agent, and it quickly became clear that he would not pursue a dialogue with Putin because of these allegations in the U.S.
Trump was in a tricky spot, being acclaimed in Moscow, yet berated in Washington. Then things started getting even more awkward. The investigation into potential collusion between his campaign team and Russian officials was now being led by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who had taken it over from FBI head James Comey in May.
Democrats had been pushing for somebody outside the Justice Department to handle the investigation after the president fired Comey a week ago.
Trump's attempt to maintain control over the investigation had failed. The American system of mutual checks and balances was effective, limiting the president's powers. Trump was all too aware of this, as a bill imposing new sanctions on Russia was drafted in July 2017. Both sides of Congress voted for it. Trump signed the bill, albeit reluctantly. Lifting sanctions independently was clearly beyond his powers.
Putin could not understand this. In our system, such a thing was impossible. Putin often said, "They won't let the U.S. president do his job." What's that all about? The president was elected, but he can't take any steps without Congress.
We see the endeavors of various members of Congress to paint an enemy picture of Russia, to use it for their own domestic purposes. The Democrats are very active in pursuing this tactic.
But now the time had come for Putin to strike back.
Regarding the USA's diplomatic representation here, it's rather drastic, because over 1,000 diplomats, employees and technical staff work in Russia. 755 of them now have to give up their jobs.
As a consequence, the US shut down the Russian trade mission in San Francisco. It was business as usual between the rivals. In January 2018, Trump held his State of the Union address and called Russia out.
As we rebuild America's strength and confidence at home, we are also restoring our strength and standing abroad. Around the world, we face rogue regimes, terrorist groups, and rivals like China and Russia that challenge our interests, our economy, and our values.
At the same time, the US Treasury published a list of 210 suspects from Putin's inner circle who were to be targeted with US sanctions. In February 2018, Special Counsel Robert Mueller filed his first charges against 13 Russian citizens and 3 Russian firms for conspiracy against the United States of America.
The defendants allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States. They established social media pages and groups to communicate with unwitting Americans.
No US citizens were charged in the Russia affair. Yet the suspicion that Trump's team may have cooperated with Moscow remained.
In Russia, the Mueller investigation was seen as part of a comprehensive attack on Trump by pro-Democrat media, newspapers, TV channels, and Trump's opponents in Congress. It was all perceived as a wide front, aiming to undermine Trump's legitimacy and his ability to run the country.
Meanwhile, Russia was looking towards its next presidential election.
For Russia, for Putin, the Russian nuclear arsenal is a critical component of what makes Russia strong. In 2018, in his annual State of the Nation address, he spent so much time including with videos showing the might of Russia's new nuclear weapons.
Russia remains a nuclear power, but nobody was talking to us constructively. Nobody has listened to us, but they will listen to us now.
таким образом щекочет какие-то самые.
This is how he reaches the hearts and minds of his voters. They love this feeling of power. Maybe he couldn't have said it at the last election, but this time it was clear that he would be running as the man who made Russia great again.
Человек, который made Russia great again.
Except for a few neighboring countries like Belarus or Ukraine, Russia cannot dominate anything or anyone, of course. Still, Putin likes to see himself as an imperator.
On March the 18th, Putin won the election with over 76% of the votes, the best result of his political career. This came as no surprise to his supporters.
Режим Путина или путинизм, как на Западе об этом пишут, заключен в том,
The essence of Putin's regime, or Putinism, as the West describes it, is that he's one of the few heads of state who doesn't just look out for the elite. He also looks out for the ordinary people who make up the majority of the population.
Donald Trump sent his congratulations too.
I had a call with President Putin and congratulated him on the victory, his electoral victory.
In view of the accusations and criminal charges, the gesture was seen as inappropriate in Washington, and Trump needed to distance himself from the Russian president again. Shortly afterwards, an event that shocked the world gave him the pretext he needed. On the 7th of April, at least 40 people were killed in what was presumed to be a poison gas attack on the rebel-held city of Duma, northeast of Damascus. The US and their allies blamed the Russian-supported Syrian regime for the attack and threatened to retaliate. They did so on the morning of April the 14th, when American, French, and British aircraft bombed an alleged chemical weapons depot. On the same day, Nikki Haley addressed the United Nations.
I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line.
Russia denied all the allegations, blaming the Syrian rebels for staging the poison gas attack to prompt the US to attack Assad, their main enemy. While Russian-American relations were put to the stress test, the world was eyeing the third meeting of the two presidents. This time, it was held in Finland.
As far as the Russian leadership goes, I think every fresh attempt to organize a top-level meeting was bound up with great hope until the meeting in Helsinki.
The two presidents talked for over 2 hours, then appeared before the media.
Our relationship has never been worse than it is now. However, that changed as of about 4 hours ago. I really believe that.
As usual, a journalist asked a question regarding Trump's stance on Russian interference in the US election.
People came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be.
It was a remarkable display where I think Putin himself was taken aback at how utterly unprepared Trump was and merely went along with what Putin said.
Here you go.
Back in Washington, criticism of the president's appearance in Helsinki was overwhelming. Donald Trump was forced to explain himself. He said it was all just a slip of the tongue.
I realize that there is a need for some clarification. It should have been obvious. I thought it would be obvious, but I would like to clarify just in case it wasn't. In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't or why it wouldn't be Russian. So, just to repeat it, I said the word would instead of wouldn't.
He knew exactly what he was saying. He simply did not want to contradict anything Putin had said at that press conference.
Putin saw the matter differently.
Мы видим, что в Соединенных Штатах есть силы, которые с легкостью готовы.
There are people in America who are willing to sacrifice the Russian-American relationship for domestic political reasons. They are willing to sacrifice their businesses and lose contracts which are worth millions, to lose the Russian market and forego jobs in the USA.
Рабочими местами в самих Соединенных Штатах.
Agreement from the US? Not this time. In retrospect, Trump's comments in Helsinki seem all the more incredible since just 3 days before the meeting, Special Counsel Mueller had filed new charges, this time against 12 Russian intelligence agents.
The defendants worked for 2 units of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, known as the GRU. The units engaged in active cyber operations to interfere in the 2016 presidential election.
Trump then dominated the headlines in October 2018 by announcing plans for the US to withdraw from the INF disarmament treaty the following year. The treaty signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987 had protected Europe from nuclear missiles for 3 decades and was widely seen as a guarantee of security even after the Cold War had ended.
John Bolton, who I know well, was then appointed as the new National Security Advisor. He's a man who rejects any kind of disarmament treaty. Furthermore, there cannot be parity between 2 nations when the economic power of one was 20 times bigger than the other. John Bolton believes that if we terminate all arms treaties, there will be a clear distinction between the USA and Russia. Then it will be easy for the USA to dictate to Russia, as parity will no longer exist.
One of John Bolton's first trips abroad was to Moscow. Typically, Putin wanted to put his guest, Trump's third national security advisor, to the test.
Насколько я помню, на гербе Соединенных Штатов изображен орлан.
As far as I remember, the coat of arms of the US depicts an eagle.
С одной стороны он держит 13 стрел, а с другой стороны оливковую ветвь, как знак миролюбивой политики, с 13 оливками.
On the one hand, it holds 13 arrows, and on the other hand, it holds an olive branch with 13 olives as the sign of the benevolent and peace-loving policy of the US.
Вопрос.
And here goes the question.
Ваш орлан уже все оливки склевал, остались одни стрелы.
Looks like your eagle has eaten all the olives, and what is left only the arrows.
After the meeting, hardliner Bolton assured everyone that he had not brought along any olives.
It is the American position that Russia's in violation. It is Russia's position that they're not in violation. So one has to ask, how do you convince the Russians to come back into compliance with obligations they don't think they're violating?
Russia's state media was outraged. Dmitry Kiselyov, the man seen by many as Putin's chief propagandist, gave a gloomy prognosis.
The feeling of threat may subside. But then, in a moment of weakness, or should I say arrogance, a hand reaches for the nuclear button. The result will be mutual destruction. There will be no winners.
Remembrance Day, November 2018. After the frosty atmosphere in Moscow, Putin and Trump were visibly chummy. They were in Paris with other world leaders to commemorate the end of the First World War. A century on from the armistice, did one picture say more than 1,000 words? Could the leaders of two hostile countries actually be friends? The US media were not the only ones speculating. Was Putin behind it all?
Do you really think that Putin gives Trump a signal, a wink, and says, "Okay, Donald, now you pretend to be the American president and I pull the strings"? Of course not. Is there any evidence for this? Maybe because he gives him the thumbs up or winks at him? Was that it?
At the next G20 summit in Argentina, Trump wanted his meeting with Putin to be private.
I probably will be meeting with President Putin. We haven't terminated that meeting. I was thinking about it, but we haven't. They'd like to have it. I think it's a very good time to have the meeting.
But then Trump backed out. 4 days earlier, Russia had fired on 3 Ukrainian naval vessels off the Crimean coast and arrested their crews. Trump cancelled his meeting with Putin on his flight to Buenos Aires. The two presidents ended up talking on the periphery of the summit. In the Kremlin, Trump's last-minute cancellation was seen as a diversionary tactic to relieve political pressure back in the States. Shortly before the Argentina summit, Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, had been found guilty of lying in court. Business connections with Kremlin officials had been maintained during the 2016 election campaign, a fact that Trump had previously denied.
Mr. Cohen has cooperated. Mr. Cohen will continue to cooperate.
Although his business in Russia was not illegal, Trump's denial raised suspicions and hampered his dialogue with Putin.
Every time Trump tried to contact him, there was a political storm in America. Even Fox News had started reporting negatively about him. So he retreated. Putin was toxic for him.
Trump was in a dilemma and needed to rethink. He announced his next move via Twitter, surprising everyone once again.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
But Trump's declaration of victory in Syria was perceived differently at home. Critics saw the withdrawal as a gift to Russia's president.
So from the Russian point of view, it's great if the United States withdraws. It'll be then up to Russia and, of course, Iran, together with the Syrian government, to figure out what happens when the war is over. However, Putin is now trying to get Western countries to contribute to the reconstruction of Syria because Russia doesn't have the money to do that.
All these theories about it being a gift to Putin are ridiculous. They just go to show how vulnerable and powerless our Western colleagues are. They're permanently trying to stigmatize Putin and Russia as their scapegoats.
By March 2019, the Syrian Democratic Forces supported by the US had won. The last IS-held bastion had fallen, and Donald Trump felt vindicated.
So here's ISIS on election day. Here's ISIS right now, if you look. So there's ISIS, and that's what we have right now, as of last night. That's what we have right now. You guys can have the map. Congratulations.
The reality on the ground, however, was far more complex.
We have across this command. The successful partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Iraqi security forces was instrumental in these gains against ISIS. But it is important to understand that even though this territory has been reclaimed, The fight against ISIS and violent extremists is not over, and our mission has not changed.
The US was keeping one foot in the door in Syria. For Trump, the mission remained a total victory. If it had been his call, America's allies would have taken over next, replacing US troops in Syria in line with his America First slogan.
Trump is an isolationist. The USA is my castle, and to hell with the rest of the world. Most of his camp are isolationists, and they couldn't care less about others, even if the world is going up in flames.
Success in Syria was a welcome distraction from developments at home. In January 2019, the New York Times revealed that the FBI itself had been investigating the president in the Russia affair after Trump fired its director James Comey in 2017. Trump was under pressure, and his most effective tactic was to distance himself from Putin.
I never worked for Russia, and you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia. Not only did I never work for Russia, I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question, because it's a whole big fat hoax. It's just a hoax.
Trump got his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, on board. A tougher stance on Moscow was needed. The INF Treaty offered the ideal opportunity.
Russia has jeopardized the United States' security interest, and we can no longer be restricted by the treaty while Russia shamelessly violates it. If Russia does not return to full and verifiable compliance with the treaty within this 6-month period, by verifiably destroying its INF-violating missiles, their launchers, and associated equipment, the treaty will terminate.
Russia refused to be dictated to by Washington. The next day, Moscow announced that Russia was also withdrawing from the pact. Putin then took aim at the US.
In the ruling class of the USA, there are many who are obsessed with the idea of a special position and superiority over the rest of the world. But can they count? I am sure that they can. Let them count the speed and range of the weapon systems we are developing.
It was a serious setback for global nuclear disarmament. Amid the presidential standoff and shattered relations, there was another new turn of events. At the end of March 2019, Robert Mueller completed his investigation into Russian interference in the US. Mueller's long run of court victories had come to an end. His report showed there was no evidence of a conspiracy between Donald Trump's campaign team and Russian officials.
It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration.
Total exoneration? Well, not quite. The final report only said that there was insufficient evidence that Trump broke the law. Still, for him, it was the success he was hoping for. The outcome was welcomed in Russia.
It was obvious from the start that it would end this way. It began as a mountain and ended as a molehill.
You have to be pretty naive if you believe that 13 Russian hackers can get 300 million Americans to vote for Trump and not Hillary Clinton.
They spent 2 years looking at it. They didn't find that, in fact, they found approaches to the Trump campaign, but none of them were adopted or accepted. No collusion, which means that they didn't coordinate.
3 months later, in June 2019, the G20 summit was held in Japan. It was the first meeting between Trump and Putin after the Mueller investigation. The atmosphere at the press conference was relaxed, almost jovial. Back home in Washington, Trump's comments met with heavy criticism, but he was still savoring his victory. But the question remained. Friendly words and smiling faces aside, how would the relationship between Moscow and Washington develop? What could the two men still achieve?
I doubt that they even discussed anything substantial. In all this time, we haven't seen the slightest result. That means that they've never agreed on anything.
For President Trump, everything was about the art of the deal. With sanctions still in place, what did Moscow have to offer in Trump's world of show and business?
Our economy was going downhill. Attempts to stimulate economic growth with state subsidies were having little effect. These proclamations that we now had a strong economy with import substitution were pure lies. We did not have this at all. Import substitution means producing goods which are competitive on a world market ourselves. But Russia does not produce any such goods.
Was Putin willing to trade in his geopolitical advantage for an economic deal to get the sanctions lifted? It remained doubtful.
A few years ago, he said that 1,000 years of Russian history was more important than economic development.
But Putin's message to the world had not changed. Russia was back.
Putin was rebuilding a Russian empire, and the heart of this empire has to give an impression of strength.
Putin, I think, would like the West to treat Russia as if it were the Soviet Union. That means a country, it's a great power, it has legitimate interests, and it's to be respected and feared.
Tonight, I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States. Thank you.
Russia may still have been on Trump's new agenda, but it was now at the bottom.
Trump cannot afford to annoy or upset his voters. Chumming up to Putin would definitely cause a ruckus.
Keep America great.
If you read the news, Russia doesn't come up. Ukraine hardly ever came up. It's just not a big issue in the U.S. outside of some very specialized points within Washington. We haven't seen actual projects or actual negotiations over anything yet.
There was a sense of disenchantment about the failure to reset the relationship on both sides. What re-emerged instead was the familiar image of the enemy, which stoked fear.
With this much mistrust between the United States and Russia, the danger of an accidental nuclear war is growing. All it takes is for one computer to fail, and suddenly the signal would be triggered and missiles would be launched. As long as there's this level of mistrust, no one would hesitate or check. They would just say, let's respond.
There is a set of issues we have to talk to Russia about, making sure that our confrontation does not turn into a conflict, that we don't cross the line into attacking one another intentionally or unintentionally, because this doesn't end with anything other than the end of life as we know it. It's unacceptable.
two enemies who are longing to become friends across the gulf between their countries.
Russia has always been marked by fights for its territory and independence. That's our national identity. And of course it was difficult for us without a clear enemy. But we don't have this problem anymore. One way or another, America will always be the enemy. And I'm happy about that.
The voices in Moscow cheering Trump's arrival in the White House had now gone quiet.
There's no question that the election of Trump may have been the high point there, or the point of maximum opportunity for then it to be missed completely. It's clear that whatever hope Russia had for a positive, productive relationship with Trump on a bilateral sense is not going to happen.
Donald Trump is focusing on the upcoming election, while Putin is turning to new territories and new admirers. For now, their common journey is over.
And the idea that you can have some grand bargain with Russia, those things don't work. I mean, they're great for people to speculate about. So beyond that, you know, it's unclear what the substance of an improvement in relations would be.
Contrary to the United States, Russian civilization has existed for 10 centuries, and there can only be a President Trump for a maximum of 9 years. So we're not worried. It's like an annoying fly buzzing around. We should not overstate the significance of the U.S. and Donald Trump.
Ultimately, the bromance between Putin and Trump began full of hope and ended in disillusion. So now it's back to square one. What's left is a world which has become less secure and a future which has become much less certain.